A teenage girl's life has been a series of heartbreaks and a haunting past she can't escape. Just as she's trying to rebuild, an encounter with a little boy uncovers shocking truths she never saw coming. A twist of fate that changes everything. Could this be a second chance? Please comment where you're listening from. And if you enjoy stories like these, subscribe for more narratives. Riley Parker sat on the edge of the old, worn couch in her living room, gripping the plastic stick so tightly her knuckles turned white. The cramped apartment smelled like cigarettes and stale beer. Riley Parker sat alone on the couch, staring at the faded wallpaper, her hands trembling as she clutched the pregnancy test. 2 pink lines. Her heart pounded. Her chest felt heavy as the realization sank in. She was just 17, still a junior in high school, and couldn't even hold down a part-time job. Her grades were slipping, and she'd been skipping more classes than she'd attended lately. Now this. She wanted to scream, to cry, to run away, but she had nowhere to go. "Mom?" Riley called hesitantly. Her voice shaky, barely carried over the blaring TV and the rhythmic clinking of glass bottles in the kitchen. Sandra, her mother, stumbled into the room a moment later. Her unbrushed hair hung in greasy strands around her face, and a cigarette dangled from her lips. She held a half-empty bottle of cheap vodka in one hand. "What now, Riley?" Sandra asked, her words slurred. She leaned against the doorway, clearly irritated. Riley's heart pounded in her chest. She needed to say it, but the words felt stuck in her throat. I'm pregnant?" She finally blurted out. For a moment, Sandra just stared at her. Then, to Riley's horror, her mother threw back her head and let out a bitter laugh. "Pregnant? You? You've got to be kidding me," Sandra said, wiping at her mascara-smeared eyes. "Mom, this is serious," Riley snapped, her voice trembling. Sandra's laughter stopped abruptly, and her expression hardened. "Serious? What's serious is how you think you're going to raise a baby when you can't even take care of yourself." The words stung like a slap. Riley's eyes filled with tears, but she refused to let them fall. "I will figure it out," she whispered, more to herself than to Sandra. "Figure it out?" Sandra scoffed, taking a long drag from her cigarette. Sandra shook her head, taking a long swig of beer. "Sure you will, sweetheart. Just like I did, right? Look how great that turned out." Riley clenched her fists. She wouldn't let her mom's failures define her. She had to believe she could do better for herself. But deep down, fear gnawed at her. How was she going to make this work? Derek, her boyfriend, was unreliable at best and dangerous at worst. Sandra was no help, and the world outside their crumbling apartment felt cold and unforgiving. As her mother's footsteps faded, Riley curled up on the couch, clutching her knees to her chest. She didn't want to cry. She hated crying. But the tears came anyway, hot and fast. She wanted someone to listen, someone to care. She wanted to be more than a mistake, more than a burden. Riley looked down at her stomach, her hand resting protectively over it. "I can do this," she whispered. Looking down at the pregnancy test again? Maybe this baby was her chance to finally be heard, to finally be enough. Maybe. But deep down, she wasn't sure she believed that. Riley pressed her back against the cold wall of her bedroom, trying to ignore the gnawing hunger in her stomach. The kitchen was empty except for a stale loaf of bread, and Sandra hadn't bothered to buy groceries. She rubbed her belly, which was beginning to show a small bump. "It's just you and me," she whispered to her unborn baby. Her voice cracked and a lump formed in her throat. "We'll figure it out, somehow." The days were long and cruel. Riley had dropped out of school. At home, things were worse. Sandra barely acknowledged her, except to throw out insults about her growing belly. "You're gonna ruin your body, you know that?" she sneered one day, as Riley tried to squeeze into a pair of jeans. One night, as Riley lay in bed, a sharp pain shot through her side. She winced and clutched her stomach, panic setting in. Was something wrong with the baby? She reached for her phone to call Derek, but the screen lit up with a text from him. "Can't talk RN, busy." Tears blurred her vision as she threw the phone across the room. Of course, he was too busy. He was always too busy. Probably off with his friends, getting high and pretending she didn't exist. The pain subsided after a while, but the fear lingered. She was utterly alone. No one cared if she was okay. No one cared if the baby was okay. The weeks crawled by, each one more difficult than the last. Riley tried to find odd jobs, anything to save up money for when the baby arrived. She scrubbed floors, cleaned toilets, and babysat for neighbors who barely remembered her name. But as the days turned into weeks and her due date approached, Riley began to doubt herself. Could she really do this? Could she really give this baby the life it deserved? One stormy night, she woke to sharp, unbearable pain. The contractions came fast and strong, and she knew it was time. "Mom!" she screamed, clutching her belly. "I need help!" Sandra groaned and rolled over on the couch, drunk as usual, pulling a blanket over her head. Riley felt the tears coming as she grabbed her bag and stumbled out the door into the rain. She flagged down a cab with the last of her strength, clutching her stomach as the driver sped toward the hospital. She didn't know it then, but the nightmare was only beginning. The delivery room was quiet except for the rhythmic beeping of machines. Riley lay on the bed, utterly spent, her entire body trembling from exhaustion. Hours of agonizing labor had taken every ounce of strength she had left. Sweat clung to her hair, which was matted against her forehead, and her fingers gripped the sheets as if holding on to consciousness. Then she heard it. A soft, piercing cry that cut through the silence like a beacon. Her baby's cry. "It's a boy," the nurse announced warmly, wrapping the squirming bundle in a blanket before placing him in Riley's trembling arms. Her breath caught as she looked at him. His face was small and scrunched, his tiny fists waving in protest. He was the most beautiful thing she'd ever seen. Tears welled up in her eyes as she whispered, "Ethan. That's your name." "Hi, Ethan. I'm your mom." For the first time in her life, Riley felt a sense of purpose. Ethan was hers. He wasn't just a baby. He was a fresh start. He was her chance to do things differently, to be better. Holding him, she vowed silently, "I will do better for you. I'll give you everything I never had." But hope is fragile. And life, Riley was learning, could be cruel. When she woke the next morning, the sunlight streaming through the window felt too bright. Her body ached, but her heart was light. She reached instinctively for the bassinet beside her bed. It was empty. Her heart stopped. She stared at the vacant spot where her baby had been, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "Nurse!" Riley's voice cracked as she shouted. Her heart raced as footsteps echoed down the hall, but when the nurse entered, her face held no answers. The hours that followed were a blur of confusion and mounting panic. No one knew where Ethan was. No one had seen him. Riley clutched the hospital sheets, her body shaking as the realization hit her. Her son was gone. By the time Sandra arrived, Riley was a wreck, her tear-streaked face pale and hollow. Sandra, as usual, wore her indifference like a shield, her face blank as she sat in the corner. "Mom, where's Ethan?" Riley's voice was raw, her hands trembling. Sandra avoided her gaze. "Look," she began, exhaling slowly as she lit a cigarette despite the hospital rules. "You're too young for this. You can't even take care of yourself, let alone a baby." The room spun as Riley stared at her mother. "What did you do?" she whispered, fear and fury boiling beneath her words. Sandra leaned back, blowing out a puff of smoke. "I found someone who could take care of him. Someone who can give him a life you never could." You sold my baby?" Riley's voice broke, the words tearing through her like shards of glass. Sandra shrugged, her eyes cold. "It's for the best. You'll thank me someday." Riley's legs gave out, and she collapsed to the floor, clutching at the empty air where her son had been. The scream that ripped from her throat wasn't just grief. It was a lifetime of feeling unseen, unheard, and powerless condensed into one primal, heart-wrenching sound. She clawed at Sandra, begging for answers. But her mother was unmoved, brushing her off as if Riley's pain were an inconvenience. Ethan was gone. Riley's dreams of redemption, of a better life, of finally being enough, they were stolen in an instant. As the hospital staff restrained her trembling form and Sandra walked away without so much as a backward glance, Riley was left with nothing but the crushing weight of her loss. In that moment, she wasn't just a girl who had lost her baby. She was a girl who had lost everything she'd ever dared to hope for. Riley spiraled after losing Ethan. She moved in with Derek, thinking he'd comfort her, but his addiction only dragged her deeper into despair. His dingy apartment became her refuge, though it smelled like sweat and stale beer. The people who came and went were strangers with empty eyes. "You're better off with us," Derek had said one night, his arms slung around her shoulders as they sat on the couch. "No one else cares, Riles." One night, they were caught stealing from a convenience store to fund his habit. And then the sirens came. The cops grabbed her, their hands rough as they shoved her into the back of a squad car, alongside Derek. The judge showed no mercy. At 19, Riley was sent to prison for 5 years. The cold steel bars of the prison gate slammed shut behind Riley, the sound echoing through the empty corridor. She was led to her cell, her wrists still red from the cuffs. Every step felt heavier than the last. This wasn't where she belonged, was it? But deep down, a voice whispered, "Where else could you end up?" Riley collapsed onto the hard cot, her head in her hands. She couldn't even cry anymore. She was past tears. Her thoughts raced back to the events that had brought her here, each memory like a shard of glass slicing through her mind. It started with desperation. After losing Ethan, something inside Riley broke. The pain of losing her son and the betrayal by her own mother left her empty, angry, and bitter. She tried to stay afloat, but the weight of it all was unbearable. Now, sitting in that cold cell, Riley couldn't shake the feeling of being utterly alone. She thought about Ethan, about the life she had imagined for him. A home filled with love, laughter, and stability. How had it all gone so wrong? Behind bars, she hit rock bottom. Nights were the hardest. She'd lie awake, imagining Ethan's tiny face, wondering if he was safe, loved, or if he even remembered her. But prison changed her in ways she never expected. Riley read every book she could find and swore she'd start over when she got out. On her release day, Riley stepped out of the prison gates, a small duffel bag slung over her shoulder. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of fall leaves, and for the first time in years, she wasn't confined by walls. Yet freedom felt heavier than she'd imagined. She had nowhere to go and no one waiting for her. Until she checked the mail at the halfway house she was assigned to. It was a letter from Aunt Grace, her mother's estranged sister. "Dear Riley, I heard you've had a rough time. I know we haven't spoken much, but I want to help. If you're ready to turn things around, come stay with me in Aurora. We'll figure things out together. Love, Aunt Grace." Riley cried for the first time in years. "Good luck out there," the guard had said as she left, but the words rang hollow. As she walked aimlessly down the road, the past few years played in her mind like a haunting reel. Riley didn't know much about her aunt except that she lived in a small town called Willow Creek, miles away from the chaos Riley was used to. It sounded like a lifeline, but it also felt like a risk. Would her aunt judge her for her mistakes? Would she even want Riley to stay once she saw the broken person she'd become? With no better options, Riley used the little money she had to buy a bus ticket. The ride was long and quiet, giving her time to think. She watched the scenery change from gritty city streets to sprawling fields and quaint houses. It was like stepping into a different world, a world she wasn't sure she belonged to. When the bus finally pulled into the station, Riley's stomach churned with nerves. She clutched the letter tightly, the address scribbled on the back. Her only guide. She walked through the unfamiliar streets, her worn sneakers crunching against the gravel. As she approached her aunt's house, her heart pounded. It was a modest, white clapboard house with flower boxes under the windows. It looked warm, inviting, like something out of a dream. Just as Riley reached the front gate, she heard a loud thud. Turning her head, she saw a little boy lying on the sidewalk, his bike tipped over beside him. Without thinking, she ran to him. Hey, are you okay? She asked, crouching down to help him up. The boy looked up at her with wide, tear-filled eyes. I'm fine, he mumbled, wincing as he tried to stand. Riley smiled gently. Let me help you. She adjusted his scraped knee and dusted off his hands. There, good as new. The boy stared at her for a moment before smiling. Thanks, lady. No problem. You should be more careful, though. He nodded, then gestured toward the house Riley had been approaching. That's my house. Want to come in? My mom makes really good cookies. Riley froze. Your house? Yeah, the boy said, already walking toward the door. Her heart raced as she followed him. Could this really be her aunt's house? And who was this boy? He looked to be about 5 years old, around the same age Ethan would have been. When the boy opened the door and called out, Mom, I'm home. Riley's breath caught. A woman appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on an apron. You're back so soon. Oh. She stopped when she saw Riley. For a moment, the two women just stared at each other. Then Aunt Grace's face softened. Riley? Riley nodded, her throat tight with emotion. Yeah, it's me. Aunt Grace stepped forward and pulled her into a hug, a warmth Riley hadn't felt in years washing over her. For the first time, she felt like maybe, just maybe, she'd found her way back to something that resembled home. But as her gaze drifted back to the little boy, a nagging thought lingered in her mind. Something about him felt so familiar, and she couldn't shake the feeling away. After dinner, Riley sat on the couch, her leg bouncing anxiously. Aunt Grace had called her into the living room, her face unusually somber. Riley's chest tightened. Something was coming, something big. Riley, Grace began, her voice hesitant. There's something I need to tell you. It's about the boy. Riley couldn't take her eyes off Ethan. Is he? Grace nodded, tears in her eyes. Yes, Riley. He's your son. Riley's heart thudded painfully in her chest. She gripped the edge of the couch, her mind racing. The boy's familiarity, the birthmark. It all pointed to an impossible truth. It was about 5 years ago. Grace started. Sandra reached out to me unexpectedly. She said she had made arrangements for a baby. She sold him Riley. Riley gasped, the air knocked out of her lungs. Hearing it spoken aloud made the pain sharper, fresher. When I heard that, I was horrified. I couldn't believe my own sister would do such a thing. I tracked him down, Riley. I found him at an agency waiting to be placed. He was just a tiny baby, so helpless. Grace said, her voice trembling. I knew I had to take him in, but I didn't know how to tell you. You were in so much pain, and your life was already spiraling out of control. I didn't want to make things worse for you. So I made a choice to raise him as my own until you were ready. The room spun, and Riley pressed her palms against her temples, trying to steady herself. Grace's eyes filled with tears. I'm so sorry, Riley. Riley couldn't hold it in any longer. She sank to her knees, sobs racking her body. Ethan, she cried. My baby. Grace knelt beside her, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. He's been waiting for you, Riley. He doesn't know it, but he's been waiting for his mother. Just then, Ethan's small footsteps echoed on the stairs. He peeked into the room, his face curious. Why are you crying? He asked softly. Riley looked up at him, her tears falling freely. She reached out her arms and Ethan hesitated before stepping closer. Ethan, Riley began, her voice thick with emotion. Do you know how special you are? He tilted his head, confused. Mom always says I'm special. She's your mother, Grace said. Ethan blinked, processing her words. You're my other mommy? Yes, Riley whispered, pulling him into her arms. I'm your mommy. Ethan hugged her back tentatively at first, then tighter as if he somehow understood. Riley held him close, her heart bursting with joy and sorrow all at once. As Grace watched, tears streamed down her face. In that moment, Riley felt the weight of her past lifting. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, she had hope. She had her son. "Can we stay together now?" Ethan asked, looking up at her with innocent eyes. Riley kissed his forehead. "Yes, sweetheart. I promise. We'll never be apart again." "I don't know how to thank you, Aunt Grace." Riley hugged Grace. "Thank you," Riley said, tears streaming down her face. For the first time in years, Riley believed in second chances, and as she held her son, she knew they were going to make it. Together. Later that evening, Riley stood in the doorway of Ethan's room, watching him sleep. His small chest rose and fell with each breath, and she felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. The doubts that had plagued her for years, the voices that told her she was unworthy, that her mistakes defined her, began to quiet. Riley turned to find Grace standing behind her. "He's happy," Grace said softly. "I want to be the mother he deserves," Riley said. "And you will be," Grace replied. "You've already started." As Riley lay in bed that night, she reflected on her journey. The pain, the mistakes, the loss, they were all part of her story, but they didn't have to define her future. She had a chance now, not just to rebuild her life, but to create something new with Ethan. As Riley drifted off to sleep, she held on to the one thing that had been missing for so long: hope. Riley's story teaches us that even in our darkest moments, redemption and love are possible. It's a reminder to never give up, no matter how tough life gets. Please like if you enjoyed this story. What do you think about Riley's journey? Her mom and her aunt's actions? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear it and see you in the next video.